my contention is, when I was making it, it was like, you're making this film, and the idea was that we're all responsible for this, that his sacrifice was for all mankind, and that for all our ills and all the things in our fallen nature, it was a redemption.
Joe Rogan has sat across from presidents, astronauts, neuroscientists, and Navy SEALs. He has interviewed men who have killed other men and women who have contacted the dead. In 25 years of broadcasting, there are almost no subjects that can make this man go genuinely, completely, atmospherically quiet. On January 9th, 2025, Mel Gibson made him go quiet. Not podcast quiet, not the polite pause before a follow-up question. Actually quiet. The kind of quiet where the audience at home can feel the air change in a room they are not physically inside. And the thing that caused it was not a confession, not a scandal, not a political revelation. It was a description of Jesus Christ so cosmically vast, so structurally different from anything Western Christianity has ever put in a church or on a screen, that Rogan, the man who trusts nothing institutional, questions everything, and has built the largest podcast audience on Earth by doing exactly that, sat back in his chair and leaned forward again. And what you are about to hear is why that moment may be the most important thing that has happened to the oldest manuscripts in Christian history since Ethiopian monks first copied them by candlelight 1,500 years ago. What Gibson actually said. Let's be precise. The specific language matters here. Rogan asked Gibson about the sequel to The Passion of the Christ. Gibson confirmed the title, The Resurrection of the Christ, and then immediately departed from anything a conventional filmmaker would say about a biblical project. There's a lot required because it's an acid trip, Gibson said. I've never read anything like it. My brother and I and Randall all sort of congregated on this. There's some good heads put together, but there's some crazy stuff. Then he laid out the architecture of the film's narrative. I think in order to really tell the story properly, you have to start with the fall of the angels. Which means you're in another place, you're in another realm. You need to go to hell, you need to go to Sheol. Rogan leaned in. So you're going to have hell? You're going to have Satan? All that? Gibson nodded. Yeah, sure. You've got to have his origin. And then Gibson described a scope that had nothing to do with a 3-day window outside Jerusalem. He described a narrative arc that runs from the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle, roughly 60 years of earthly time anchored by the resurrection, but reaching backward and forward across dimensions of reality that, in Gibson's own words, do not operate on human time. He called it a journey through the big realms, spiritual territories where good and evil are, as he put it, slugging it out for the souls of mankind. Then he asked Rogan a question that sat in the room like something physical. Why are we even important? Little old flawed humanity. Why are we important in that process where the big realms are slugging it out over us? Rogan did not have an answer. The silence that followed was the most revealing moment of a 3-hour conversation. Because Joe Rogan always has something to say, and this time, he did not. Here is the question you need to sit with before we go further. If Gibson was simply describing a Hollywood fantasy, a creative invention designed to generate box office excitement, why would it produce that specific reaction in that specific man? Rogan is not impressed by spectacle. He has seen too much of it. What stops him is truth. What stopped him in that room was not the scale of what Gibson described. It was the fact that it already existed, already written, already preserved, in texts that the Western Church spent 17 centuries trying to destroy. The blueprint was already written. Here's what most people who watched that interview did not realize. Every single element Gibson described, the fall of the angels, the descent through multiple realms, the journey into Sheol, the cosmic battle between good and evil across layered dimensions, was already documented nearly 2,000 years ago. Not by Gibson, not by his co-writers, by monks living in cliff-face monasteries carved into the mountains of northern Ethiopia. And the reason those texts are not in your Bible is one of the most calculated acts of institutional suppression in the entire history of religion. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserves up to 88 books in its canon. The Protestant Bible contains 66. The Catholic Bible contains 73. The difference is not minor variation. It is entire scriptures, complete texts that the earliest Christians read, quoted, and treated as divine revelation, that were deliberately excluded by councils of bishops who decided ordinary believers should never encounter what they described. Among those preserved texts, the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Ascension of Isaiah, three ancient documents that together provide an exact structural blueprint for every cosmic element Gibson described to Rogan on that January afternoon in Austin, Texas. These are not fringe documents invented by outsiders. The Book of Enoch was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, confirming it was widely circulated in the Jewish communities that gave birth to Christianity. Early church fathers, including Tertullian and Irenaeus, quoted it freely and treated it as genuine revelation. The New Testament itself, in the Epistle of Jude, verses 14 and 15, quotes the Book of Enoch almost word for word and treats it as authoritative prophecy. Let that land. The authors of your Bible knew these texts. They cited these texts. They considered them sacred. In 363 AD, the Council of Laodicea formally rejected them. Copies were ordered destroyed. And for the next 17 centuries, the Western world never encountered what they contained. Ethiopia kept every single one of them. And what those texts describe is going to fundamentally change how you think about the story you thought you knew. The architecture of heaven. The Ascension of Isaiah was written in the late 1st or early 2nd century, within living memory of the apostles themselves. It describes the structure of creation as 7 distinct heavens, each more overwhelming than the last. In the first heaven, angels oversee earthly affairs. In the second, celestial bodies are directed. In the third, Isaiah encounters paradise itself, the tree of life, gates of living fire, architecture made not of stone, but of pure energy. By the 6th heaven, the text says a human body simply cannot endure what exists there. The 7th is a realm where no created being can survive at full presence. And it is from the 7th heaven that Christ descends. Here is the detail that maps directly onto what Gibson described to Rogan. At every level of heaven, on his way down to earth, Christ deliberately veils his own radiance. He dims himself at each successive realm so the beings there perceive him as one of their own. Not because his power fades, because if he arrived anywhere at full magnitude, existence itself could not survive the encounter. By the time he reaches Bethlehem, he is a human infant. Every realm of creation watched the incarnation happen. Almost none of them understood what they were looking at. The crucifixion in this framework is not merely a human execution. It is the source of all life experiencing death, a rupture in the fabric of reality itself. And the resurrection is not simply a body returning to life. It is the most powerful being in existence reclaiming his full glory after voluntarily confining that power within human flesh. Every veil removed, every limitation shed, the full radiance unleashed simultaneously across every dimension. Do you see now why Gibson called it an acid trip? Do you see why he said he had never read anything like it? He wasn't describing something he invented. He was describing something he found, buried specifically so you would never make the connection yourself. The Son of Man, nobody showed you. Chapter 46 of the Book of Enoch describes a figure called the Son of Man, the Chosen One, the righteous judge. His head is white as wool. His face radiates a grace so overwhelming it breaks human language. He sits at the center of a heavenly courtroom surrounded by rivers of fire. Angels of incomprehensible power fall to their knees. His authority extends across every realm, every dimension, every age of time. Now open the book of Revelation, the one apocalyptic text that survived the Western canonical filter. Chapter 1, verses 14 through 16. Hair white as wool, eyes like blazing fire, feet like bronze refined in a furnace, voice like the roar of rushing waters. Dr. George Nicholsburg, who spent decades at the University of Iowa producing the definitive English commentary on 1st Enoch, laid these two texts side by side and reached a conclusion that most Western theologians prefer not to discuss in public. The author of Revelation was drawing directly from the Enochic tradition, not inventing a new vision, echoing one that was already ancient. The Western Church kept the echo. It burned the source. Ethiopia kept the source. And what that source describes is exactly what Gibson told the world's largest podcast audience he is putting on IMAX screens in March 2027. Ask yourself this: if these texts were simply unreliable mythology, if they contained nothing that threatened institutional authority, why would bishops order them destroyed? Libraries burn books for one reason, not because the books are wrong, because the books are dangerous to the people doing the burning. Why Rogan's reaction tells you everything. Joe Rogan has built his entire platform on challenging authority. He questions pharmaceutical companies, government agencies, mainstream media, and organized religion with equal and consistent intensity. He describes himself as a former Catholic turned agnostic who finds institutional religion deeply problematic. He is not predisposed to accept extraordinary claims from anyone. And yet when Gibson described this cosmic architecture, Rogan did not push back. He did not challenge the premise. He did not deploy the skepticism that is his entire professional identity. He asked follow-up questions with genuine curiosity, not mockery, not dismissal, fascination. Later in the conversation, when Gibson explained that every single apostle died rather than deny what they had witnessed, that not one of them recanted even under torture, even when recanting would have saved their lives, Rogan went visibly still. He acknowledged quietly that this is a data point that lives outside theology and inside human behavior. People don't die for things they know to be lies. Rogan didn't convert in that room. Nobody expected him to. But something passed between those two men that the audience could feel. A man who trusts nothing institutional heard a description of reality so vast and so specifically documented that dismissing it required more effort than entertaining it. And that is exactly the reaction the Ethiopian manuscripts have always produced in people who encounter them for the first time. Not immediate belief. Something closer to recognition. As if the story being described is older than the objections against it. The monastery at the edge of the world. In the Tigray Mountains of northern Ethiopia, there are monasteries carved into sheer cliff faces that can only be reached by rope and bare hands. No road, no vehicle, no casual visitor. You either climb or you do not enter. The monks who have lived in those monasteries across the centuries did not consider themselves guardians of religion. They considered themselves guardians of the original architecture of the faith, the version that existed before Rome decided to edit it. The Garima Gospels, radiocarbon dated by Oxford University to between 330 and 660 AD, are among the oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts surviving anywhere on Earth. Full-color illuminations of Christ's life, preserved in astonishing condition inside a mountain monastery that most of the Western world did not know existed. When French ethnologist Jacques Mercier was trusted by Ethiopian authorities to authenticate those manuscripts in the late 1990s, he described the moment he first handled them: the silence in the room, the trembling in his own fingers, the vertigo of realizing that what was in front of him predated almost everything he had been taught was authoritative. That vertigo is what Gibson found in the Ethiopian texts. That vertigo is what he brought into a recording studio in Austin, Texas, and put directly in front of the most listened-to voice in global media. And here is what the Ethiopian tradition did not anticipate, could not have anticipated, across 15 centuries of isolation and preservation, that the moment these texts finally reached a mass audience would not come through a seminary or a scholarly journal or a church synod. It would come through a filmmaker who had already proven he would tell the unfiltered version of this story regardless of what it cost him, and the most famous skeptic alive, who would go quiet when he heard it. The film that changed the rules. The Resurrection of the Christ is not a rumor. It is currently filming at Cinecittà Studios in Rome, being shot on IMAX cameras across an 11-month production schedule. The combined budget for both parts reportedly exceeds $250 million, the most expensive project Gibson has ever directed. Principal photography began October 6, 2025. Additional shooting is taking place in Matera, the same ancient southern Italian city used as Jerusalem in the original Passion. Gibson spent 7 years writing the script with his brother Donald and Randall Wallace, the writer of Braveheart. Theologians and historians were consulted specifically for biblical and historical accuracy. The film has been split into 2 parts. Part 1 releases on Good Friday, March 26, 2027. Part 2, 40 days later, on Ascension Day. Finnish actor Jaakko Auten has been cast as Jesus, replacing Jim Caviezel. The entire original cast was recontracted due to scheduling and de-aging considerations. Lionsgate is handling North American distribution. Sources close to the production have confirmed the film will include battles between angels and demons across multiple realms, depicted with the full visual architecture Gibson outlined to Rogan. The narrative runs from the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle, roughly 60 years of earthly time, but reaching across a cosmic scope that no studio film has ever attempted. And here is the detail that tells you everything you need to know about what Gibson believes he has made. At the American film market, when international buyers were told they would not be allowed to read the scripts before committing to distribution deals, in an industry that runs entirely on advanced reads and pitch decks, most of them wrote checks on faith alone. In Hollywood, that does not happen, ever, unless the people writing the checks have already decided that the man asking has earned a level of trust that bypasses the normal rules. Gibson earned that trust in 2004 when he released The Passion of the Christ, a film the entire studio system refused to touch, that he financed personally for $30 million, that returned $612 million at the global box office while critics predicted commercial disaster. He was right once when everyone said he was wrong. The buyers know that. They bought in again. What the Western Church decided you shouldn't know. When the Council of Nicaea convened in 325 AD and the Council of Laodicea followed in 363 AD, the books that were removed from the Western canon shared a specific characteristic. They did not describe humanity as spiritually dependent on institutional intermediaries. They described human beings as spiritually autonomous, direct recipients of divine communication, capable of moving through the heavenly realms without a bishop's permission, without a sacrament, without a purchased indulgence. A humanity that believes that does not need a priestly class to manage its relationship with the divine. It does not fear excommunication. It does not pay temple taxes to access what it already possesses. In the language of every empire that has ever existed, it becomes ungovernable. The Ascension of Isaiah, the Book of Enoch, the full Ethiopic cosmology. These texts described a Christ so vast, so transdimensional, so far beyond the reach of any single institution, that preserving them inside the official canon would have made every ecclesiastical power structure on earth structurally irrelevant, so the councils cut them. And they told you the canon was closed. Ethiopia never accepted that closure. When Islamic expansion swept across North Africa in the 7th century, it created a geographic barrier that cut Ethiopian Christianity off from Mediterranean church politics entirely. The book burnings happened on the other side of a wall those monks never had to cross. While Europe stumbled through the Dark Ages and Rome consolidated control over the Christian narrative, the monasteries of Ethiopia, sealed inside cliff fortresses, reachable only by rope, preserved the original architecture of the faith, untouched, unedited, unapproved. For 15 centuries they copied, they prayed, they trusted. They had no way of knowing that on January 9th, 2025, a filmmaker sitting across from a podcaster in Texas would describe their manuscripts to a global audience and make the most committed skeptic in media go quiet. But the texts say they knew anyway. The Mashafa Ketis, one of the manuscripts preserved in those monasteries, describes the conditions under which its own contents would be released into the world. The trigger was not a date. The trigger was a description. A world hyper-connected, but fundamentally false, where information travels faster than truth and the manufactured image replaces lived reality. A world where trust in governments, institutions, and organized religion collapses simultaneously. A world starving for something direct and unmediated. We are living inside that description right now. The question nobody is asking. Here is what this moment actually represents, if you are willing to follow it to its conclusion. The Passion of the Christ changed cinema. It demonstrated that an unfiltered, brutally honest depiction of the Christian story, not sanitized, not made comfortable for secular critics, not adjusted to protect studio relationships, could reach audiences that mainstream Hollywood had written off entirely. It did $612 million, while every expert predicted failure. Now Gibson returns with a canvas that is not 3 hours, but 2 films. Not one location, but 7 cosmological realms. Not a human execution, but a cosmic rupture. And the source material he is drawing from has been waiting inside Ethiopian manuscripts for nearly 2,000 years for exactly this moment. When this film reaches theaters in March 2027, billions of people will encounter, many of them for the first time in their lives, the Christ that the Ethiopian monks preserved. Not the simplified, manageable, institutionally safe version. The full version. The being who descended through 7 veiled heavens, who confronted fallen angels in their own territory, who reclaimed authority across dimensions that the Western Bible barely hints at. And when those audiences walk out of the theater, they are going to start asking questions. The same question Rogan asked by going quiet. If this story was in the texts all along, if the monks in the mountains knew it and copied it and died protecting it, why were we never told? That question is the most dangerous thing Gibson is putting on screen. Not the demons, not the battle scenes, not the descent into Sheol. The question of who decided what you were allowed to know about your own faith, and why. Gibson told Rogan he is a Catholic who believes this stuff to the full. He is not making a spectacle. He is making an act of recovery, pulling something back into the light that was buried specifically so it would never reach you. The Ethiopian monks held the line for 15 centuries. Gibson spent 7 years writing the script. Rogan went quiet in Austin, Texas on a January afternoon. And now you have heard it. So tell me in the comments, which element of what Gibson described stopped you the way it stopped Rogan? Was it the 7 heavens? The veiled descent? The cosmic battle that makes every human soul the stakes of something we can barely perceive? Tell me what landed. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because when this film drops in March 2027, the conversation that follows is going to be unlike anything that has happened in the intersection of faith, history, and media in your lifetime. The source is finally reaching the screen, and we are just getting started. The man who will not be stopped. It is worth pausing on who Mel Gibson actually is in this context, because the Western media conversation about him has been so dominated by the personal and the controversial that most people have lost sight of the one undeniable fact. Nobody on earth has a better track record of being right about the Christian story when every institutional voice tells him he is wrong. In 2003, every major studio in Hollywood passed on the Passion of the Christ. The objections were framed in commercial terms: too intense, too narrow in audience, too uncompromising in its visual theology. But the deeper objection the one that rarely got stated plainly, was that Gibson was telling the story without filtering it through the sensitivity mechanisms that institutional culture applies to the Jesus narrative. He was not softening the violence. He was not domesticating the theology. He was not adjusting the story to make it comfortable for people who had already decided they knew what it meant. He financed it himself. He released it into theaters through a tiny distributor. He watched every critic predict failure while evangelical churches organized bus trips to see a film that most of mainstream America had been told was dangerous. $612 million, the highest-grossing R-rated film in history at the time. A film that generated more conversations about the Christian faith in secular households than anything a church had produced in decades. Gibson was right. Everyone else was wrong. Now consider this. Gibson has spent 7 years on the sequel. 7 years of theological consultation, historical research, and direct engagement with the source texts that Western Christianity has suppressed since the 4th century. He has split the project into 2 films because the story he found cannot be contained in one. He is filming on IMAX cameras because the scale of what he is depicting demands a frame large enough to hold it. He is spending over $250 million because he believes what the Ethiopian manuscripts describe is true, and that the world is finally ready to see it. Rogan, the professional skeptic, heard the pitch and went quiet. International film buyers, the most cynical financial operators in global media, wrote checks without reading the script. At some point, the question is no longer whether Gibson has found something real. The question is what it means that it was hidden in the first place, and what changes when it finally reaches a global audience of billions. What happens in March 2027? Part 1 releases on Good Friday. Good Friday, the day the story the film is about begins its final movement. The timing is not incidental. Gibson has always understood that the Christian narrative is not just content, it is architecture. The story has a structure that mirrors the calendar, mirrors the seasons, mirrors the movement of human life from darkness into light. Part 2 releases 40 days later on Ascension Day. 40 days. The same window the Western Bible compresses into a single paragraph. The same window that the Mashapha Ketis and the Ascension of Isaiah fill with the most cosmically dense teaching in the Christian tradition. Gibson is not just making a film. He is making a liturgical event. 2 acts released in accordance with the actual calendar of the story, inviting the audience to live inside the narrative in real time rather than consume it as entertainment. He is giving people 40 days between the films, 40 days to sit with Part 1, 40 days to think about what they watched, 40 days to ask the questions that the first film raises before the second film answers them. The Ethiopian monks who preserved these texts understood something about time that modern content consumption has almost entirely abandoned. That some things cannot be absorbed in a single sitting. That the most important revelations require space between encounters. That the silence between viewings is not empty. It is where the real work happens. Gibson, whether consciously or not, has built that silence into the release structure of his film. He is asking his audience to do something extraordinary in 2027. To wait, to sit with partial knowledge, to live for 40 days in the unresolved space between death and resurrection. That is not a marketing strategy. That is theology. Why this matters beyond the film. The conversation that happened in Austin, Texas on January 9, 2025 was about more than a movie. It was about the oldest question in the history of Western civilization. What were we told, and what were we not told, and who made that decision? The Ethiopian manuscripts do not ask you to abandon your faith. They ask you to expand it. They do not contradict the Christ of the Western Gospels. They reveal the dimensions of that figure that were stripped from the story before it reached you. They show you the being behind the biography. The cosmic architecture that the 4 Gospels gesture toward, but never fully map. Gibson found that architecture, He spent 7 years turning it into a script. He told Rogan, and Rogan went quiet. And now those texts, preserved by monks who lived on cliffs, copied by candlelight for 15 centuries, guarded through wars and famines and total isolation from the rest of Christendom, are about to reach billions of people on the largest screens ever built. The monks who preserved these manuscripts trusted. They did not know who would eventually need what they were keeping. They simply understood that it mattered enough to protect with their lives and their silence. That trust is about to be answered. The well, as the Ethiopian saying goes, has been open for 15 centuries. The world is finally coming to drink.